Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in AP English, and we now turn in our conversation of the Iliad to a quick review of books 1 through 9. We just finished with our lecture over book 9, that singularly important book where Achilles is met by the embassy of three, Odysseus, Phoenix, as well as Ajax, and they invite him to return, and he says, no. I'm going to call this brief lecture Achilles' crisis of faith. And I think it will make sense as we begin our conversation now, moving towards the end of the Iliad. But I want to set up so much of our study here going forward in AP English around this first text, the Iliad, okay? And some of the questions that we're obviously going to resurrect. Let's work quickly. First of all, scholars have suggested, although they could be wrong, that the Iliad was probably initially an oral story that was a part of some kind of 3 or 4 or even longer day celebration, religious celebration, where the poem was recited, okay, out loud. To recite it probably start to finish, depending upon speed and everything, you're probably looking at about 24 hours to be able to recite the entire poem. So if that were the case, right about the end of the first day or the beginning of the second day, probably book 9. So in other words, that's kind of like we might think about it as the first third of the poem, if you will, all right? I want to suggest that in book 9, we have not only a summation of major themes, but we have a direct challenge to the warrior code, which is why I think when we study our Plato's Republic, Socrates will argue that he doesn't want his young would-be warriors studying warrior scholars, studying Homer. And I think this will become clear as we get into this conversation, right? Now, our work in 303, our learning theory, that notion of connecting new information to old information, is based on the research of a couple of important cognitive psychologists, Piaget and Vygotsky, a French thinker and a Russian scholar. And both of them argue that the goal of true learning is what they refer to as cognitive disequilibrium or cognitive dissonance. By this we mean the following. There comes moments in great works of literature where the protagonist, and by extension obviously you the student reading the text, comes to certain kinds of questions that somehow disequilibrate. Don't equilibrate, don't give balance, but somehow imbalance. And it's through this process, then, that we grow as thinkers. I think that the Iliad is a classic example of this. If we can see, right, in the Iliad how this is working, we're going to see it elsewhere, that is to say at level 3A. For example, note the judgment of Paris, right? Although not in the Iliad, it stands behind the Iliad as one of those pre-Iliadic texts, where Hera comes to Paris and offers him what? Well, Scooby Snacks, teammate, lots of money, right? Athena comes to Paris and offers him what? Power, right? We might say kleos to that degree. Finally, Aphrodite offers Paris love. He does choose Aphrodite. Note Agamemnon's offer to Achilles. Note that in many ways it's similar. That is to say, he offers, obviously, lots and lots of money. He offers military power. That's represented probably best with those stallions, right? Okay? And obviously, he offers him all kinds of chances of love, even his own daughter, one of his own daughters, as a wife. Some scholars have even, in fact, used this to point out that probably Homer did know about the judgment of Paris, and he's making an allusion to it there. But I want to have us think about this from another perspective. The judgment of Paris asks, by extension, the offer of Agamemnon to Achilles asks, what is it that all men, remember we are in a patriarchal society, but all men want? I mean, money, power, love. When Achilles turns down Agamemnon in book 9, he's ostensibly saying, none of this stuff, the teammate, Scooby Snacks, the honor, the kleos, the glory, matter to me anymore, right? And it leads then to a crisis of faith, identity, a crisis of belief. What really matters? For example, watch this. Phinox will tell Achilles a story about Meleager, right? We mentioned this in Lecture 9. This is that notion that learn from the past, learn from the old stories, grow by studying the old stories, the past, in other words, right? He even says it. I'm an old man, I'm going to tell you an old story. Achilles is, of course, singing songs outside of his tent on that lyre, as we said, a powerful symbol. But notice, Achilles no longer cares about the old stories or what they have to teach, right? And remember, we said this early on in our conversation, that we are defined by the stories we tell, the stories we discard, the stories we accept. Achilles seems to be discarding the story of the warrior code, right? The obvious question now is, what stories will Achilles accept going forward? How will he define himself and who it is and who he is? Of course, we have some questions. Watch this. Why does Achilles withdraw from the war? What do you mean? Briseis was taken from him. Why does he refuse then Odysseus and Phoenix's and Ajax's, through Agamemnon's, offer? And why does he go so nuts, finally, when Patroclus is killed? By the way, note the name, Patroclus, Kleos. They sound very similar, don't they? Interesting, right? That is to say, why is it that Achilles loses his stuff later in the Iliad? I think there is a suggested answer that Achilles is having a serious crisis of faith, belief, or conviction in regards to the warrior code. Why? Well, think about it. He learns through the experience of what happens in Book 1 with Agamemnon that Team A can be taken away very quickly. One minute he has Briseis, the next minute he does not. That power can be used arbitrarily, and therefore power is an illusion of a kind. And finally, that love can be lost. Briseis goes away from him. Achilles withdraws from the war because he can't believe in the warrior code of Team A and Kleos anymore. What to do? Well, choose the second fate that his mother Thetis has told him is a possibility, to live a long life but to be forgotten. I think he's probably ready to do that. The poem seems to suggest that he's ready to do that. Then, of course, there's that dark night of the soul of Pascal or St. John of the Cross's idea. You can go to our Harvard Classics lectures to hear my comments as well on St. Augustine's idea of this, and what it looks like when you lose your closest pal. This is also, of course, going to be Hamlet's challenge. He lost his father. This will be Stephen Dadles's challenge of faith when we study it later in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. In other words, when we get to the death of Patroclus and the insane response of Achilles, it might be simply that Achilles is lost. He's pulled back into a conflict he doesn't believe in. And there is the source of the rage. He is disequilibrated. Now, as we move forward into the final books of the Iliad, let's pay attention to this crisis of identity and faith. Notice, Hector seems to be a pretty committed guy to the things he believes in. He is a man of conviction. Achilles, on the other hand, clearly from Book 9 we know this. He is struggling as to, what is it that I'll really believe in? Let's pay attention to this tension as it unfolds in the text to follow. Think about it as it unfolds, for example, with Telemachus, the young boy, the young son of Odysseus, as well as Odysseus in the Odyssey. Think of it as it relates to Aeneas in the Aeneid. Think of it as it relates to Oedipus and Antigone and Creon in those classic texts of Sophocles. Think about that tension as it relates to Dante's Pilgrim. I've mentioned Hamlet already. To be or not to be, to act or not to act, to believe or not to believe. Think about it when we meet Milton's Adam and Eve, and of course even Satan. Think about it when we meet Crane's Henry in Red Badge of Courage. And I've mentioned already Joyce's Stephen Dadles in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Or think about that dissonance that occurs with both Nick as well as with Gatsby in The Great Gatsby. All of these texts share in common with the Iliad this notion of what happens when you go from something you're thoroughly convinced you believe in to beginning to doubt that very thing that you are so sure in your past life you were so sure about, and now all of a sudden you're not sure anymore. If Vygotsky Piaget, and of course Plato from the Republic are right. The important learning for both our characters in these texts, as well as obviously for us, happens when we are dragged out of the cave of ignorance into the light. But remember, from our study of Plato's Republic, there's fear and there's pain always associated in that kind of learning. I think it's good for us to be challenged. Let's return to this amazing text, the Iliad. Now we keep playing the game of learning, right? And I'm giving you, I hope, one more thing to think about. We turn now to book number 10 as we prepare for the death of Patroclus. Thank you.